Good morning, students. Today I will begin with the third part of the chapter The Best Christmas Present in the World. But before starting with the third part of the chapter, let's have a quick recap of what we had read in the first part and in the second part of this chapter. We have seen that the story begins with the narrator who goes to an antique shop to buy a roll-top desk. The desk he chose particularly had burnt marks and it was completely damaged by water and fire. So he kept it in the garage and started to repair it. At the time of repairing, he found a secret drawer. There, in that secret drawer, he finds a small tin box where he found a slip of paper stuck on it with a sellotape. It is written there, Jim's last letter to be buried with her when she will die. He opened the letter, although he did not want to do it. But his curiosity took over him. He opened the letter and saw that it was a letter from a person named Jim MacPherson, who had written this letter to his wife Connie. And the letter explains how Jim was fighting against German army as a British soldier, and in the war front during Christmas, how the things had taken turn. Instead of fighting, how both the armies celebrated Christmas by sharing food and spending time together in smoking, laughing, talking, drinking, and eating. How they greeted each other, how they played football, how they agreed with each other in all the aspects, and how they hoped to unite their families again. In the last part of the letter, Jim had promised Connie that next Christmas Eve he will definitely be at home and celebrate Christmas together. This was the promise that Jim made to his wife, and this promise is the foundation of what we are going to read in the next part of the prose. I folded the letter again and slipped it carefully back into its envelope. I kept awake all night. The narrator, after reading the letter, what did he do? He put the letter in its envelope. He did it very carefully. But he could not sleep throughout the night. Whole night he kept on thinking what to do. By morning I knew what I had to do. I drove into Bridport, just a few miles away. I asked a boy walking his dog where Copper Beaches was. House number 12 turned out to be nothing but a burnt out shell, the roof gaping, the windows boarded up. Next morning, the narrator knew what to do. He took his car and drove to the address. When he went there, he found nothing but a damaged house. He did not understand anything. I knocked at the house next door and asked if anyone knew the whereabouts of a Mrs. Macpherson. So, what did he do? He went to a neighborhood house to ask about Mrs. Macpherson. Oh, yes, said the old man in his slippers. He knew her well. A lovely old lady, he told me, a bit muddle headed. Underline the word muddle headed. It means a person who is confused, a confused person. So, the neighbor informed the narrator that Connie is a fine and wise lady, but lately she had become muddle headed. That means a little bit confused person. But at her age, she was entitled to be, wasn't she? 101 years old. Underline 101 years old. The neighbor says that she was 101 years old. So it is very natural to be muddle headed at this age. She had been in the house when it caught fire. No one really knew how the fire had started, but it could well have been candles. She used candles rather than electricity because she always thought electricity was too expensive. The fireman had got her out just in time. She was in a nursing home now. He told me. Burlington House on the Dorchester Road, on the other side of the town. Underline Burlington House on the Dorchester Road. So, how the house caught fire? As the neighbor explains that on one fine evening the house caught fire, and he thought that it was because of the candles, because Connie did not use electricity as it is too expensive for her. So maybe because of the candles, the house caught the fire and it was damaged completely. But as the firemen came there just in time and took her out of the house, she is safe now. Now she was shifted to a nursing home where she is being treated. And the nursing home is in the other side of the town, that is in the Burlington House on the Dorchester Road. So let us see what the narrator do next. I found Burlington House nursing home easily enough. So we got to understand that the narrator decided to go there to meet her. So he went there in the nursing home. There were paper chains up in the hallway and a lighted Christmas tree stood in the corner with a lopsided angle on the top. I said I was a friend come to visit Mrs. Macpherson to bring her a Christmas present. I could see, though, into the dining room where everyone was wearing a paper hat and singing. The matron had a hat on too and seemed very happy enough to see me. She even offered me a mince pie. Underline the words mince pie. So, when the narrator went into the nursing home, he found that the entire hallway was decorated with paper chains, underline paper chains, and there was a Christmas tree in one corner, underline a lighted Christmas tree. He told a matron that he is there to visit Mrs. Macpherson to bring her a Christmas present. And seeing the narrator, the matron, that means the nurse, became very happy. She even offered me a mince pie. Even the nurse had offered him a mince pie. She walked me along the corridor. Mrs. Macpherson is not in with the others, she told me. She's rather confused today, so we thought it best if she had a good rest. She has no family, you know. No one visits. So I'm sure she will be only too pleased to see you. She took me into a conservatory. Underline the word conservatory. Conservatory is a room, a kind of greenhouse. It is a house made up of glass. Plants are kept inside it. Such kind of house only takes sunlight and trapped it. As a result, plants grow out nicely. And this type of house is known as a greenhouse or a conservatory. So, the nurse took the narrator into a conservatory with Wicker chairs. Wicker means flexible branches of plants. These flexible branches of plants are taken out of the plants. They're woven together to make chairs. So, there in the conservatory, the narrator found only wicker chairs and potted plants all around him. And while the nurse took him to the room of Mrs. Macpherson, the nurse told him on the way that Connie was not feeling fine on that particular day. Probably she is confused. So she thought that she needs some rest. She required some rest. So they kept her in a separate room. The old lady was sitting in a wheelchair, her hands folded in her lap. She had silver white hair, pinned into a wispy bun. Wispy, underline the word wispy, it means untidy. She was gazing out at the garden. So when the narrator go inside the room, he saw the lady was sitting in a wheelchair. Her hair was grey, and the lady was looking outside. Rather say, she was gazing, she was staring at outside at the garden. Hello, I said. She turned and looked up at me vacantly. Happy Christmas, Connie. I went on. I found this. I think it's yours. As I was speaking, her eyes never left my face. I opened the tin box and gave it to her. That was the moment her eyes lit up with recognition and her face became suffused with a sudden glow of happiness. I explained about the desk, about how I had found it, but I don't think she was listening. For a while, she said nothing but stroked the letter tenderly with her fingertips. So, when the narrator looked the lady, she was little confused and unhappy. She was sad. The narrator wished her Happy Christmas and kept the letter in her lap. And he started to explain how he found the letter and how he reached her. But Connie was so confused that she was looking at him vacantly. But when she saw the letter, a sudden glow was there in her face. The narrator could understand that whatever he was explaining her, he was not actually listening. She was in some other world. She was lost in the thought of Jim. And that is what made her think that the person sitting in front of her was actually her husband. So she mistook the narrator as her husband Jim. And what she did, we will see. Suddenly he reached out and took my hand. So, as she mistook the narrator to be her husband Jim, he took his hand. Her eyes were filled with tears. You told me you would come home by Christmas, dearest, she said, and here you are, the best Christmas present in the world. Come closer, Jim dear. Sit down. I sat down beside her and she kissed my cheek. I read your letter so often, Jim. Every day. I wanted to hear your voice in my head. It always made me feel you were with me. And now you are. Now you are back. You can read it to me yourself. Would you do that for me, Jim dear? I just want to hear your voice again. I would love that so much. And then perhaps we will have some tea. I have made you a nice Christmas cake, marzipan all around. I know how much you love marzipan. So, Connie was confused. He mistook the narrator. He thought that his husband Jim had come back. So she utters a few words that are very touching. She said that she had read the letter so many times. Now she is so happy that Jim had come back and he had kept his promise. She said she knew how much Jim liked marzipan, Christmas cake, and all this. So she will again make this for him. She requested the narrator to read the letter because she wanted to hear his voice again, and feel the love. There was a glow of happiness in her face. The narrator could not tell her the truth. He just sit there to see how love can affect a person. So, this part of the story made the title so apt, so correct, so justifiable because the best present one can give anyone is happiness, good thoughts, good deed. Other things are temporary. So, this is the story. We have already discussed the summary of the chapter. In the next video, we will discuss the question answer. Till then, read the chapter and understand it. But today we will do the comprehension check. Comprehension check, page number 15. Why did the author go to Bridport? We all know. The answer is the author went to Bridport in search of Mrs. Jim Macpherson. He wanted to give that letter back to her. Second question. How old was Mrs. Macpherson now? Mrs. Macpherson was 101-year-old. Where was she? She was in a nursing home in Burlington House on the Dorchester Road on the other side of the town, Bridport. Next, comprehension check, page number 16. Who did Connie Macpherson think her visitor was? Connie Macpherson thought that her visitor was her husband Jim Macpherson. Which sentence in the text shows that the visitor did not try to hide his identity? The sentence which shows that the visitor did not try to hide his identity is, I explained about the desk, about how I found it, but don't think she was listening.